Most chefs don't ruin classic dishes because they're untalented. They ruin them because they start changing things before they understand what made the dish work in the first place. Overcomplication, ego, elevation, social media food culture. Today, we're talking about how classic dishes lose their identity and how real chefs refine food without erasing it. All that right now on the IncrEDIBLE Discourse. Woohoo! So, last week, my mother-in-law was visiting from Miami. We started talking about food and how she grew up in El Salvador. She began telling me the story about how her father owned some land and was a farmer. It was a different time. There was no refrigeration, no stores to buy things and supplies, and they relied solely on the land and the love and time they invested in it. Her father was a skilled man. He owned cows, goats, pigs, and farmed the land for vegetables and fruits. Her mom had chickens they used for eggs and meat, and that her mom would make fresh cheese from the milk from the cows. Her dad butchered the animals and cured the meat with salt to preserve them for long periods of time. Bones became soups. Scraps became meals. When they needed rice or dry beans, her dad would take an animal or something that he grew to the city, right, and sold it or traded it. It was an ecosystem that made sense for their family. Nothing at all was wasted because waste meant losing food for survival. And while she was talking, I realized that a lot of food we now call traditional wasn't created for nostalgia. It wasn't created for aesthetics. It wasn't even created to impress people. It was created because systems had to work. And that's what tradition actually is, right? Tradition is proof that something survived pressure. It survived scarcity, survived repetition. If a dish lasted generations, there's usually a good reason for it. The balance made sense, the ingredients had purpose, the structure held up under real conditions. And somewhere along the line, modern cooking started to forget that. Now, look, I'm not anti-innovation, not even close. Every cuisine we admire today evolved from adaptation. Trade routes changed ingredients. Migration blended cultures. Preservation techniques created entirely new categories of food. Innovation is part of cooking. It always has been. Something one of my mentors in the past said, historically, there is no cuisine that hasn't been influenced at some point or another, like tomatoes in Italy or chilies in Asia. But innovation used to come from necessity. Now it often comes from visibility. And those are two very different things. Right now, especially online, there's this pressure to constantly reinvent, to elevate, to make dishes louder, bigger, more technical, more visually complicated. And young cooks feel like if they're not deconstructing something, or fucking foaming something, or fucking smoking something, or stacking 12 components onto a plate, then somehow they're not being creative enough. But here's the problem. A lot of cooks start changing dishes before they understand why the original version worked in the first place. And that's where dishes start to lose their identity. And this is where I think there's a massive difference between refinement and erasure. Because refinement strengthens the structure. Erasure ignores it. If you refine a dish, it still makes sense, right? Maybe the seasoning is cleaner. Maybe the execution is tighter. Maybe the texture improves. But the soul of the dish is still intact. The eater still recognizes it emotionally. Erasure is different. It happens when technique starts replacing purpose, when complexity becomes the goal instead of the tool, when cooks chase attention instead of clarity. And honestly, guests can feel that shit immediately, even if they can't explain why. Have you ever eaten a dish that technically tastes good, but somehow feels disconnected? Like every individual component works on its own, right? But together, it just doesn't feel grounded anymore. And that's usually because the internal logic of the dish disappeared. More components doesn't automatically create more meaning. Sometimes it just creates more noise. And I think social media has accelerated this problem dramatically because the algorithm rewards visibility, not restraint. Loud plates perform better online than disciplined ones. A clean, perfectly executed classic usually gets less attention than a plate covered in tweezers, powders, foams, micro-herbs, smoke, and fucking 10 different sauces. But attention and craftsmanship are not the same thing. And I think a lot of young cooks are burning themselves out trying to prove creativity before they fully mastered clarity. Because real creativity isn't randomness. Real creativity understands structure first. I think it's something that all cooks go through. It's the learning process that creates skill sets that through understanding, right? And there was a night early in my career when I tried to modernize shrimp and grits, or, as we like to say in the industry, my take on shrimp and grits. And on paper, honestly, it sounded great. The original dish already worked. Creamy stone ground grits, properly seared shrimp, bacon, scallions, a little heat, and good balance. It was soulful, structured. Every ingredient had a job. But I wanted to push it. For whatever reason, I swapped the bacon for chorizo, started layering extra acidity into it, added more garnish, more moving parts, more contrast, more chef. And little by little, the dish started losing the thing that made it work in the first place. The smoke started fighting the sweetness of the shrimp. The extra fat dulled the corn flavor in the grits. The garnish distracted instead of supported. And every individual component tasted great, but together, the plate lost its center. It wasn't shrimp and grits anymore. It was me trying to fucking prove that I was smarter than the dish. And while it sold well, it wasn't a hit. And you hear shit like, it was a great variation or interesting take. Meaning the OG version was still what people gravitated to. I wasn't inventing shit. I was actually putting myself up for comparison against something that stood the test of time without honoring it and understanding what made the dish what it was in the first place. Because that's the trap, right? And that's the trap a lot of cooks fall into, especially earlier on. You start confusing complexity with mastery. You think adding more automatically means you're creating more. But a lot of the time, you're just burying the original structure under your own ego. And look, experimentation matters, creativity matters, pushing yourself matters. But there's a difference between evolving a dish and overpowering it. So the lesson here is refinement sharpens structure. Ego overloads it. The dish didn't need more technique. It needed restraint. It needed understanding. The original version already had logic built into it. Fat, sweetness, texture, heat, balance. Once I stepped outside the logic without respecting it, the entire thing collapsed. And honestly, I think that's happening in kitchens everywhere across the board right now. Because cooks are trying to innovate before they fully understand how to listen to the food in front of them. So take a second to realize and understand why things work the way they do, and have an appreciation for its origin and its foundations. A lot of these classic dishes weren't invented by Michelin chefs, or even chefs at all. They were invented by cooks that needed to survive, to use what they had and make that shit sustain over eras of evolution. You can't evolve what you don't understand, and the problem is, kitchens today reward this behavior more than people want to admit. Right now. Because we're in this strange era where cooks are developing online identities before they fully developed real kitchen discipline. Everybody wants a signature style. Everybody wants a viral dish. Everybody wants to stand out. And somewhere in that process, simplicity started getting mistaken for lack of skill. And that's dangerous. Because the best cooks I've ever worked with were usually the calmest ones on the line. They weren't trying to force attention onto every plate. They weren't building dishes just to fucking prove that they could. They understood balance, structure, restraint. They knew when to stop. And that's a real skill. And honestly, I think younger cooks today are under a different kind of pressure than a lot of us coming up. Social media changed the pace of validation completely. A dish doesn't just have to eat well anymore. Now it has to photograph well. It has to stop somebody mid-scroll. It has to look elevated. And because of that, cooks start designing plates for cameras instead of guests. But restaurants don't survive on fucking camera angles. They survive on consistency. And consistency is where overcomplication starts getting exposed immediately. Because once service starts, all the extra noise gets stress tested in real time. That beautiful 12-component plate that you designed during prep, this shit looks real different when you're 20 tickets deep and your saute station is behind. Somebody burned a pickup and now your garnish cook is scrambling because one little tiny component suddenly became the entire fucking bottleneck for the entire rail. That's how dishes die in professional kitchens. Not because the idea was bad, but because the system couldn't support it. And this is where I think a lot of cooks misunderstand what innovation actually looks like in a professional environment. Real innovation is usually invisible. It's not always smoke and tweezers and micro herbs. Sometimes innovation is reducing pickup time by 30 seconds. Sometimes it's reorganizing mise en place so the station flows cleaner. Sometimes it's improving yield, tightening seasoning, simplifying a garnish so the dish eats better under pressure. That's real refinement. Because service punishes instability immediately. If a dish only works when conditions are perfect, it doesn't actually fucking work. And I've seen this happen over and over and over and over and over again in kitchens. A cook creates a dish in a calm environment with unlimited time, unlimited focus, perfect lighting, and zero pressure, and then gets fucking frustrated when the dish collapses during real Saturday night service. But that pressure is the test, right? That's the difference between a concept and a menu item. And honestly, some of the most successful chefs in the world became successful because they understood restraint better than everyone else around them. They understood that the guest remembers how the dish felt, not how many fucking components were on the plate. A clean roasted chicken plate that's perfectly seasoned, properly rested, beautifully balanced, and consistent every single night will outperform an overbuilt dish almost every single time. Not because it's simpler, but because it's disciplined. And discipline is becoming rarer in the modern food culture because attention rewards excess. More garnish, more sauce, more contrast, more technique, more explanation. Everything becomes so fucking loud. But louder isn't always smarter. Sometimes the smartest thing a chef can do is remove something instead of adding something. And from a system standpoint, this matters more than people realize. Because overcomplication doesn't just affect the flavor of the dish, right? It's the behind the scenes. It affects labor, prep, food cost, communication, consistency, execution. Every unnecessary garnish adds labor. Every extra component increases the chance of failure. And every overbuilt plate slows the rail down. And eventually, what started as creativity becomes operational drag. That's when menus lose identity. That's when cooks burn out. That's when guests start feeling disconnected from the food, even if they can't explain why. Because deep down, people respond to clarity. They respond to a food that feels intentional, not food that feels like it's trying too hard. So let's make this practical. It's time for your
Quick Fix of the Week.
If you're a cook right now and you want to start refining a classic dish without destroying it, here's the simplest framework I can give you. Before you change anything, cook the original version exactly as written first. Not your version, not the version you saw online, the original structure. Because if you don't understand why the dish works right now, you have no reference point for improving it later. Then start identifying function. What is the fat doing? What is the acid doing? What texture is balancing the dish? What ingredient is carrying sweetness, heat, salinity, body? Because once you understand function, now you're making intentional decisions instead of fucking random substitutions. And after that, change one. One variable at a time. Just one. Not 4, not 5. Don't change the protein, the acid, the garnish, and the starch simultaneously and then wonder why the entire fucking thing feels disconnected. You've removed your ability to understand what actually improved the dish and what hurt it. That's how professionals test food. Controlled changes, controlled pressure, controlled evaluation. It seems like a lengthy process, but it is. Because cooking isn't some magically produced phenomenon, and it surely isn't fucking luck. Great food takes time. It takes thinking. It takes patience and understanding, all working together in unison. And all of those things don't just happen on the first take. At least it's very rare in my experience. And honestly, this applies way beyond restaurants too, because home cooks do this all the time without realizing it. They see a recipe online, they swap 6 ingredients immediately, skip half the technique, change the cook time, and then eat the shit and say, oh, well, this recipe fucking sucks. No. The structure of the recipe got broken. And this is where restraint becomes a real skill. Because a lot of cooks think creativity means constantly adding. But sometimes refinement is subtraction. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do to a dish is remove the unnecessary part that's distracting from the thing that people actually love about it in the first place. If you can't explain what an ingredient is doing in the dish, you probably shouldn't replace it. So, once you start looking at food this way, you begin realizing something really important. Innovation belongs in the prep and R&D, not in the middle of a slam service, because service is execution, not experimentation. And this is why so many dishes sound better in meetings than they perform in service. Because pressure exposes weak systems immediately. A dish might feel exciting during development. Hell, it might even photograph beautifully. But if your stations can't execute it consistently under real pressure, eventually the cracks start showing. The pickup slows down. Communication breaks down. Components start getting skipped. Quality drops. And little by little, the identity of the dish starts disappearing under the weight of its own creativity or complexity or whatever it is that you want to call it. And that's why real professional kitchens eventually learn a hard truth here. Creativity without structure eventually collapses. And that's where real innovation starts separating itself from performance. I think the chefs who truly understand innovation eventually stop trying so hard to appear innovative. Because once you really understand food, you realize most great cooking isn't built on constant reinvention. It's built on clarity. A chef who deeply understands balance, structure, seasoning, texture, timing, and restraint can make small adjustments that completely improve a dish without losing the thing that made people connect to it in the first place. That's real refinement. And most guests don't even ever notice that. Not consciously, anyway. They just know the food feels better. It's cleaner. It's more focused, more confident. That's the irony of real innovation in professional kitchens. The best version of it is often invisible. It's not louder. It's more intentional. And I think that's the difference between cooks who chase attention and cooks who build longevity. One is trying to impress people. The other one's trying to fucking feed them. So here's your pro tip of the week.
Pro tips from the chef's list.
Before you change a classic dish, force yourself to answer one question first. What problem am I actually trying to solve? Because if the answer is to make it more impressive, you've already started heading down the wrong direction. Real refinement solves something. Maybe the dish eats cleaner. Maybe the pickup becomes more efficient. Maybe the balance improves. Maybe the texture gets tighter. Maybe the execution becomes more consistent under pressure. But there needs to be a purpose behind the change. And if you can't clearly explain the function of the adjustment, there's a good chance the dish didn't actually need it in the first place. That mindset alone will save young cooks years of overcomplicating food. Because mastery isn't rebellion. It's stewardship. Today's final thought leads us to this.
Food for thought.
I think the longer you cook, the more you realize food is carrying more than flavor. It carries memory, identity, place, people. A lot of the dishes we call classic today survive because somebody needed them to. Families built systems around them. Cultures shaped themselves around them. And those recipes lasted because they worked, not just technically, but emotionally. And I think there's a certain responsibility cooks inherit when we step into professional kitchens. Not to freeze food in time, but to understand it deeply enough that we can evolve it without stripping away the thing that made people care about it. Because there's a difference between making food louder and making it better. And the chefs who last the longest usually figure out that real confidence in the kitchen doesn't come from constantly proving creativity. It comes from understanding restraint. Tradition isn't a cage. It's a foundation. Next time on the Incredible Discourse, I'm sitting down with one of the most influential chefs in modern American cuisine, Chef Norman Van Aken. Boy, I've been waiting for this one to come out. We're talking about storytelling through food, mentorship, legacy, creativity, and what younger chefs still misunderstand about growth in this industry. This isn't just a conversation about cooking, it's a conversation about identity, evolution, and what it actually means to build a lasting career in hospitality. And after today's episode, I think this interview is going to be the perfect follow-up. Because before you can innovate responsibly, you have to understand where the craft came from in the first place. And if this episode made you think, I'd love to hear your thoughts. Or if you heard this and you think of someone who needs to hear this message, send this shit to them. Something like, what's a classic dish you've seen completely overcomplicated? Or maybe one you've personally tried to reinvent. Drop a comment, share the episode, and keep this conversation going. And if you're serious about becoming stronger in the kitchen, not just more creative, but more disciplined, more intentional, and more consistent, make sure you're subscribed to the Incredible Discourse wherever you get your podcasts. And you can also find full episode blogs, downloadable resources, and more shit on the website. Thank you guys for listening today. And I'm Mark Grigsby, and I'll see you next time right here on the Incredible Discourse.